Australia today is one of the most advanced countries in the world, in terms of quality of life, that is. This is not a controversial statement, it is a fact. While yes, there are issues, especially in rural communities and such, the city of Sydney regularly reaches the top 10 list for best places to live in the world. Even I, as a proud Queenslander and lover of Brisbane, will admit that I do quite like Sydney. It is a great city. It is a gorgeous city visually too, especially when you consider the harbour. What is now a thriving, bustling, far superior city to Melbourne was barely, 250 years ago, a village. The story of the Dunbar truly encapsulates early Sydney, a city of roughness, toil and pain, mired by heartbreak. The first 100 years of colonial Australia, specifically New South Wales, has had a lot said about it. There is no denying the pain experienced by Aboriginal Australians, and this story does not attempt to mitigate or deny that. Rather, I would like to shift the camera to a left a little bit, and talk about the experiences of the settlers who came to Australia sometimes, and often in this period, unwillingly, and with the briefest of chances at a better life. In particular those who had to come here, who had made a life which would tragically end one stormy night at the end of a long sea voyage on the rocks at Sydney Heads. I am of course talking about the wreck of the Dunbar, a now almost forgotten story in Australia's past. In 1788, the First Fleet, led by Governor Arthur Phillip, made landfall in Port Jackson, Sydney Cove, declaring the land now the first settlement of the colony of New South Wales, in the name of King George III of the United Kingdom. In this very moment, what would become the city of Sydney was born. For much of the colony's early existence, the township of what would become, and what I will refer to for its simplicity's sake as Sydney, was expanded through hard labour by a burgeoning convict population. In 1790, the Second Fleet arrived, some of which included some of my ancestors, with more convicts, and on the fleets and the ships of convicts would pull into Sydney Cove, expanding the population of the town, which in itself had evolved from a collection of mud-floored shacks to, in 1856, a population of nearly 40,000 people. A fair cry shy of the 5 million who now call Sydney home, but not a small number for the time. Sydney itself by 1857 had become a true centre of wealth and growth, as had Australia. The export industry in Australia being key goods such as merino wool, farm produce, and of course gold from the mining gold rushes sweeping the nation. The convicts being shipped into the city had ceased in 1840, with the Eden being the last ship to arrive and the next chapter in the growing city's promising future as a city of free settlers rather than convicts was all set to begin. But when I say free settlers, there's a caveat to that. For most of the settlers when it comes to Australia at this time, particularly in the East Coast, are not free in the sense that you may think. They are the lowest levels of the Irish and the Scottish working class. They are the poor fishermen in England who are forced out of their homes by rich landlords. They are really the people who the world wants to forget. The convicts themselves had ceased being shipped into Sydney in 1840. But make no mistake, the people who would now arrive, who would now call Sydney home, were not some upper-class rich settler looking for some land, no. By and large, they were the people that had nowhere else to go. The connection between Sydney, this far-off outpost of empire, and the mother country, although now far closer due to the advent of the clipper ship, and seemingly quite safe, was about to prove to the residents of the town that Mother Nature, as always, is not to be trifled with, that London and Sydney, although it seemed that they were closer now, were as far apart as ever. The first ships to arrive in Sydney were of older designs, your more classical age of sail ships. For much of the early 1800s it did remain this way, often exhausted or repurposed ships carrying convicts, sometimes in appalling conditions comparable to the slave trade, across the world through the heat and the ice to reach Sydney Cove. The end of the Napoleonic Wars, though, left Britain the undisputed master of the seas, and much of the Royal Navy's strength would be focused on maintaining this position and keeping the shipping lanes clear. With no threats at sea and no need for convoys, the need for speed in moving goods from one place to another became the order of the day. The term clipper most likely derived from the verb clip, which in the past was used to describe a situation where you would run or fly swiftly. For example, she is moving along at a fair clip, would be a ship is moving quickly. The birth of the term clipper in a nautical sense is hazy at best, but this is not uncommon as the naming conventions with the ships do vary a lot over the time. For example, a late war destroyer from 1945 has nearly nothing to do with a modern destroyer from 1980 or a pre-1914 destroyer. At first, fast sailing vessels were referred to as Virginia-built or pilot boat modelled, with the name Baltimore-built appearing during the War of 1812, the Yanks being somewhat experts in building fast blockade runners, which in the final days of the slave trade would serve the slave as well, being some of the only ships that could outrun the Royal Navy's anti-slavery patrols. From around 1850 onward though, the term Baltimore clipper had become more common, and remained current in the last quarter of the 18th century, through to the first half of the 19th century, alongside that of what we would now retrospectively call clipper ships. Clear as mud, right? The long short is, a clipper is a speed-built merchant ship and a passenger vessel from the mid-1800s. Clippers were mostly built in Britain and the US, and were largely designed to be longer and far narrower than their warship counterparts or their Indiaman predecessors. There was no specific sail plan, mind you. Quite often though, you would find clippers to have large sail areas with 4 or 5 square sails on their masts. The most, in my totally not biased opinion, beautiful clipper, and what often springs to mind when one thinks of how these ships were designed, is the Thermopylae. This period in history would also see the birth of shipping lines designed for combined cargo passenger journeys. On the transatlantic route, great steamship lines such as that of Cunard, Collins, and later White Star would be born, and passengers would flock in droves back and forward in ever-growing luxury. But for the longer routes to Asia and New South Wales, the steamship just wasn't there yet. This would be the routes where the clipper would come into its own, racing from ports on the southern English coast such as that of Plymouth, down to the icy winds of the roaring 40s, before swinging north after passing Melbourne and entering Sydney Cove. A particularly fast clipper could do this voyage in a little over 2 months at sea. For comparison's sake, this was like upgrading from an old C-47 Skytrain to the Concorde. For early Sydney settlers, this new vital link with the motherland was a godsend. The chance for those who had made it, who had arrived with nothing and yet built themselves a life, to return home, to a home that they never thought they would see again, to see family and friends since they had long been apart from. The clipper allowed them to do this, and it was incredibly alluring. And for many who could afford it, they would book passage on these ships. Like I said, the age of the convict was over, and although the new people arriving, the settlers, were of the very, very poor, bottom society, those early settlers who were convicts, who had since been given their freedom and through hard toil, some of them had made themselves an actual profitable life in the inland and in the interiors, near cities like Goulburn and Queanbeyan. It was a chance for them to go home in a triumphant return. In a sense, the world felt a lot smaller, and one of these ships was the Dunbar of the Dunbar line. On the 30th of November 1854, the fantastic ship Dunbar was launched in Sunderland, in the northeast of England. A sleek and powerful looking vessel known colloquially as a Blackwall frigate, the Dunbar was built for the Dunbar line, from British oak and East India teak, as a first-class passenger vessel and cargo ship, blurring the line between a frigate and a clipper. At the time of her launching, she was officially the largest wooden vessel built in Sunderland at the time. Her purpose was to be used for transporting gold and passengers to and from Australia in response to the gold rushes in the colonies, specifically in Melbourne and Sydney. Sporting 3 masts, a copper hull, and a great rampant line figurehead, the Dunbar with all the fittings was 1,198 tonnes, 61.5 metres or 201.9 feet long, with a breadth of 11 metres, 35 feet, and a draft of 6.9 metres, or 22.7 feet. All in all, she was very strong, large and formidable, built to the absolute best standards of safety in her day. The Dunbar, though, would not find her way into the Australian trade until 1856, as the British Empire found itself at war, and for the first time in its existence, the colony of Australia itself felt true peril. It was believed that during this war, the Crimean War, that the Russian Empire at any time could sail a fleet down the east coast of Australia and raid the growing port cities with impunity like Sydney, and that the small Royal Navy squadron was simply not able to stop them. Australian cities would now begin to fortify themselves, building forts such as that of Fort Denison to guard against the threat, whilst the Dunbar would find herself conscripted into the war effort as a troop transport. Relieved of her Crimean War duty, the Dunbar would finally join the bustling trade of clippers on the Australian route in 1856. Upon her fitting out, the Illustrated London News put simply when describing the vessel as saying, "She is the finest merchant ship afloat." Abraham Meyer, the local railway store owner in Queanbeyan, New South Wales, and what you can see on screen right now is actually footage of the train station today in Queanbeyan, New South Wales, may well have thought as much when he boarded the ship alongside his fellow passenger Hyacinth McCoy, the owner of the Tuggeranong homestead in Waniassa, which is now in suburban Canberra. The ship's passenger list, therefore, was a veritable who's who of New South Welshman society. All in all, there were 122 souls aboard the Dunbar under the greatly experienced Captain James Green. Among the Duncan Dunbar Line's skippers, very few were as accomplished as James Green. The son of a fisherman, Green was a Scotsman from the Orkney Islands, and he was not even remotely unaware of the dangers at sea. At age 12, he served on the James Peterson, and then the convict ship Teresa. When she went down, Green was the last aboard, only abandoning ship at the last moment. At age 29 in 1851, Green was given his certificate of competency as a master mariner. By 1856, Green had sailed to Australia a total of 7 times. He had commanded the Waterloo and the Vimeria, and all his passages had been completed with no incident or complaint from anyone aboard. The dashing young captain had in fact become somewhat of a darling of Sydney society when he was in port. In fact, he had in the past been gifted a sum of money by his very grateful passengers due to the level of comfort his leadership provided. The passenger manifest varied greatly, from the businessmen I mentioned moments ago to entire families who were returning to their homes in New South Wales, from corner store owners to students who had returned to Europe to study. It was the veritable who's who of society.
Singing to Raleigh had a tea, and we're bound for Botany Bay.
Given though what was to occur on the ship on her voyage to Sydney Cove, we don't know all that much about what the exact day-to-day life was aboard the Dunbar. However, drawing from previous voyages and what we do know from the coroner inquest, we can speak to a certain length about what life was like for those aboard. What we know for sure is that the Dunbar's second passage to Sydney was incredibly fast. It was an 81-day voyage, a fair clip, see what I did there, faster than the 8th months of the First Fleet some 70 years earlier. The ship sailed south from Plymouth through the North and then South Atlantic before turning east and catching the trade winds known as the Roaring Forties at about 42 degrees south, passing between South Australia and Antarctica before swinging north and threading the needle between Tasmania and Victoria to make her way north to Sydney. There is no record of the ship making port during the voyage, and by all accounts the ship's journey was quiet and happy with no deaths, no serious illnesses, and no other untoward incidents. The Dunbar sustained no damage to her hull or sails, at least as far as we know, and as far as we are aware, no babies were born during this trip, thank God. The passengers inevitably would have experienced changes in weather, from the cool, tepid climate of Europe to the blistering heat of the tropics and the equator and the icy cold of the Southern Ocean. The skippers of the vocalists Zemindar and Duncan Dunbar all sighted the ship on their voyages as she overtook them, despite leaving Plymouth days after the Dunbar did. Yes, there is another clipper called the Duncan Dunbar and the Dunbar. The specifics of everyday life can largely be gained through published daily routines on the other ships of the Duncan Dunbar line. The ships run by Duncan Dunbar were run to the highest possible standards in order to ensure the wealthiest of clients aboard, and Captain Green was a stickler for the rules. Early in the voyage, it is fair to say the captain would have assembled all aboard with his officers at his side and informed them what was to be expected of them. Every passenger who was well was expected to be up by about 6 a.m, with ablutions completed by the time breakfast was called by 8 a.m. Passengers were to wash daily, to wear clean clothes to avoid disease. Those in steerage or the intermediate classes cleaned their own berths and washed their own clothes, bedding, and scrubbed their own utensils and toilet pots, with shoddy work having to be repeated after inspection by the crew. Cabin passengers, though, had their quarters cleaned and clothes washed by the crew. They could eat in their cabin, their food served by a steward, or at communal dining, and every single cabin passenger would get a turn at sitting with the captain at his table for dinner. Lunch was called at 1 p.m. and dinner at 6 with lights out at 10 p.m. There was a Church of England service held every Sunday on deck, and Bible readings would take place. Passengers were expected to be present for Sergeant Bain's health inspection checks at regular intervals, again to avoid disease, and there were school lessons for children aboard. Between these events, passengers could promenade on their designated areas of deck, write letters, read books, journal away to their heart's content. They're most likely, as was common at the time, an onboard newspaper, and passengers were encouraged to contribute their observations, cartoons, jokes, and tips on how to make the time pass. Passengers joked, smoked, sang, played musical instruments together. Naturally, of course, there would have been some onboard romance and intrigue, as with all long sea voyages. Deck games such as cricket, quoits, and others would have taken place, and skeet shooting most definitely occurred when birds flew within range of the Dunbar. Plays would have been put on by the passengers for others aboard, poetry read, and for the 81 days she was at sea, this would have been the routine of the small township that now called the Dunbar home. At least until midnight, on the 20th of August 1857, as the Dunbar sighted the lights of the cliffs of Sydney Heads, and made her way towards the gap between the north and south faces to enter the harbour. But that, leaving you on a bit of a cliffhanger, is a story for next time. Like, comment, subscribe, and join us here at the Lesser of Two Weevils, where we, together, cover our love for nautical history, and I will do my best to bring you, in short order, the second part of the story of the tragedy of the Dunbar.